See they know the truth and
Please consider supporting us by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons. Your support will be greatly appreciated.
Part 2. And the bridge was suspended between the two eternities, arched so high up there that the watchman could from his tower see all that had gone before and all that was to come. And that is why the anxious, helpless peoples of this crazy world continue to look up in despair and cry, "O watchman, tell us in this endless night just what the signs of promise are." Chapter 12. A View from the Bridge. The summing up. This has been an interpretation of history. I have swept across 6,000 years with the story of the African people, touching here and there on prehistoric beginnings, such as at Woes, and selectively spotlighting the blackout areas in that history in my broad sweep through the millenniums. My own field studies in just about every region on the continent, and my interpretation even of the data of many of the scholars appearing in their bibliography, often lead to quite different conclusions than theirs. Indeed, these modern Westerners either ignore or contradict some of the best evidence of the ancient writers on Africa. The conflict of viewpoints on the history of the African people develops as issues in the work, and I suppose that at the present level of civilization, such a conflict should be expected between those who represent the masters of the globe and those who are in rebellion against them as the writers of the history of the people they oppress. Invariably, there is a deeply felt need to present the dominated people as childlike creatures, inferior by an ordinance of nature and therefore helpless without the permanent rule and guiding hand of the master race. Perhaps the highlights in the history of the blacks, which is all this work claims to be, would be even more clearly understood if I had written backwards, beginning with the present. For one thing, less documentation would be required, for by focusing on predominantly black South Africa, Rhodesia, and the present-day Sudan, the whole world could see, almost at a glance, exactly what happened to black Egypt many centuries ago. The script of the play, Whites Against Blacks, is the same. The eternal drive glorifying white blood is the same, finding direct expression in all Caucasian-controlled social and economic systems. In South Africa, the Dutch offerings by black women are classified coloreds and ranked as a separate ethnic group below the Dutch in social and economic status, but far above the Africans. In Egypt, the coloreds gradually became the majority as more and more whites came in and more blacks moved southward. The name Egyptian was taken over by the whites and their northern coloreds as applying to themselves alone. The blacks who were the original Egyptians were no longer called Egyptians, just as the blacks in South Africa today are no longer called South Africans there, only the whites are South Africans. Both in Egypt and South Africa, the scheme was to make the mulattoes a separate ethnic group, superior to the blacks because of Caucasian blood, thus creating mutual hatreds that would make unity difficult, if not impossible. By giving all mulattoes privileges and opportunities denied to blacks, the scheme worked not only in South Africa and ancient Egypt, but it was successful throughout the world and still operates in the 1970s. The white man has every reason to proudly view his handiwork in managing people and pronounce it good. In the Sudan, the white Arabs were so successful that their coloreds consider themselves Arabs, not Africans, and look down contemptuously on the blacks in the southern Sudan, exactly the same as the Ethiopian coloreds regarded this same once all-black region, Ethiopia, centuries ago. The picture in the northern Sudan today, then, is exactly the same as the picture was in northern Ethiopia, Egypt, after it became predominantly Afro-Asian and Afro-European, and the picture in the southern Sudan today is the same all-black picture southern Ethiopia, the Sudan itself, presented over 2,000 years ago. And just as their ancient forefathers battled then against the Egyptian coloreds, the blacks in the southern Sudan at the very hour these lines were being written were still arrayed in battle against the Arabs, now predominantly colored, and for the same ancient reasons. Does anyone wonder why this all-important white-created color factor is skipped over by white historians? If they were scientific in their approach and objective in their methods, they would deal with the mulatto role in black history, even though it was a major source of white power and the white man's most effective agent in helping to destroy black civilizations everywhere they were found. White historians would really grow in stature if they themselves wrote the story, wrote it as it was. This will never happen, of course. for they would be recording how the increasing number of coloreds after each white invasion made it easy to credit them with all the great advances the blacks themselves had made. They, the white writers, would be telling how these half-blacks came to be classified as Caucasoids, and how helpful this was in obliterating Black Egypt from the pages of sexual history. By this master stroke, through their own sexual creations, they were able to erase the blacks as the first builders of a great civilization and deliberately rob them of that honor. Further research, especially field research, will reveal an even more amazing story. A study of the general history of mankind reveals no people who have suffered so much in every area of life and survived. One thinks immediately of the Jews and the systematic oppression they encountered in every land, but they were not enslaved, not since the days when whites were generally enslaved everywhere and slavery had nothing to do with race. We have seen that after the murderous revolt of the white slaves in the 13th century, white slavery ended, and thereafter the concentration was on blacks alone. The Jews, being white and tenaciously clinging to their own heritage, were able to find escape routes not open to blacks anywhere: business, finance, and science. They were free to study, and study they did, surpassing almost all other peoples in the resulting intellectual supremacy. Learning became a second religion. They had seen that two of the certain ways to overcome their oppressors were the mastery of wealth and intellectual excellence. They therefore became moneylenders to emperors, kings, and popes. Meanwhile, the blacks were still being hunted down and enslaved, and, when freed, they were kept as close to the status of slaves as such efforts could achieve. Yet today we are beginning, just beginning, to learn about the heights from which they were driven. One of the highly important things this study revealed was how the very color of black came to mean slave, and therefore equated with bad luck, inferiority, and shame. We have dared to go beyond the limits and the guidelines set for us by the SARS of history and geography to discover that ancient Ethiopia covered North Africa to the Mediterranean Sea, that Egypt was the northeastern division of that empire, and that even as late as 3100 BC, when white Asians held Lower Egypt, Ethiopians still held much of their homeland in Upper Egypt. In short, almost all of Egypt was black as late as 3100 BC. I say as late as 3100 BC to emphasize the fact again that all this is well known to white historians concerned with Africa. They know because when the earliest Greek and Roman writers studied in the land, Egypt was still Black Egypt. They knew what the history was, and they left the records. Even when Herodotus arrived, Black civilization was known to be so ancient that its beginning was lost in a distant past beyond memory. But when he arrived, he found a very mixed Egyptian population of whites, browns, yellows, and blacks, the first three groups now drawing a line between themselves as Egyptians, while giving to the blacks the lower class status along with their original name of Ethiopians, original as Greek term. There may have been some justice in this, since when Herodotus was in Egypt, the masses of non-integrating blacks had themselves rejected both Egypt and the Egyptian names as the Asians and Afro-Asians became the majority, and they had concentrated below a new borderline as Ethiopians in an Ethiopian empire that no longer included Egypt. The most important fact here is that the Greeks were the first Europeans to know that the most advanced civilization of the ancient world was in Africa, the first Europeans to study and be directly influenced by it, and to proclaim it to the world boldly and without reservations. Indeed, it is from Greek history, including their myths and legends, that we get some of the best insights into the early history of the blacks. They drew upon the land of the blacks for architectural designs, city planning, sculpture, science, and even religion. These they reshaped and made Greek. The Greeks were the best traveling students in the world. In their relations with Africa, they exemplified, as no other people had, the eclectic process of civilization and progress, the readiness to borrow from other peoples the best in their culture, to be reshaped or made over to suit one's own ideals and needs. Having lost most of our own written records through both destruction, endless displacement, and the gradual loss of African scribes, the black world owes the debt of everlasting thanks to those early Greek and Roman writers, but mostly Greek, who included much of our ancient history with their own and passed it down through the centuries. We salute them. The early disruption of African civilization, as we have seen, was followed by a long series of absolute blockades to progress. These included the combined forces of nature, ever-expanding deserts, scarcity of water, hostile climate, and the ravages of disease arising largely from conditions of famine. And yet, while the primary causes of disaster had set in motion the dispersions of peoples from the earliest times, searching for survival sites, through it all, the kingdoms and empires were built, destroyed, and built again. These were the slow-moving, voluntary migrations from which so many of the small and large societies developed with different languages and dialects. The invaders raiding into the continent from Asia and Europe formed the second centuries-long battlefronts against which the blacks had to fight for survival. These wars spanned several thousand years, and in an earlier chapter I wondered out loud, and still wonder, how any people, weakened by perpetual hunger and disease, could possibly carry on wars of resistance to the white invaders for over 5,000 years. This they did, and this their descendants must know and remember with pride. That black resistance to white domination covered over 5,000 years. When the enslavers pressed in upon them from the north, from the east, from the west, and from the south, they continued the fight. The resistance to slavery continued while the continent was being depopulated by it, with the active participation of many black chiefs and kings seeking wealth and the white man's promise of security from all of their black foes. The third battle lines for survival were therefore internal, and points up one of the main contributions that they made toward their domination by other peoples. As time went on, they became so preoccupied with warring against each other that they seemed to regard the whites as friends by comparison. This seeming contradiction is baffling, for while there is nothing new about a people fighting among themselves, they generally stop if outsiders attack, forget their differences, and join united ranks against the common foes. Caucasians will wage frightful wars against other Caucasians, but will quickly unite, as though by instinct, against non-whites, not only in wars, but in international policies. They have developed a kind of built-in solidarity in their relations with non-Caucasian peoples. This fact, as much as anything else, helps to explain their position as masters of the world. On the other hand, and in glaring contrast, disunity and non-cooperation have been characteristic of black societies, and this fact, more than anything else, helps in the understanding not only of why the blacks eventually lost in their battles against the whites, but why also, even today, they are still unable to deal with the white world. This situation of antagonism, self-hatred, and attending disunity in the race is a matter of such grave concern that I have returned to it again and again throughout these discussions. The only reason for dealing with the role played by the mulattoes in black history, for example, was to show how baffling and complex the problem is. For they were used not only to help disguise the most significant achievements of the blacks, but they were also effectively used to further enhance and perpetuate the already existing conditions and divisions among them. Now, they had just as much right to be classified as white as they did to be classified as black, but they found it expedient to operate in both worlds, exploiting the blacks while serving the interests of the whites. There could never be any clear-cut judgment or defense against internal subdivision along any color line, because in almost every black society, it was possible to find some mulattoes who were as loyal to the race as anyone could be, and some blackest of the blacks who might be paid agents of the Arabs or Europeans. The state of black Africa, then, was a state of perpetual fears. Fears of being hunted down and attacked from without, fears of betrayal by unknown followers from within, fears of attacks by other migrating blacks who themselves were fleeing from danger, fears of hunger, ever-mounting disease, and of the alarming number of deaths that could never become common no matter how often they occurred. Fears of all kinds, another source of mutual suspicions and distrust. Centuries of this, and the amazing outcome, the blacks became their own worst enemies and therefore, increasingly, a helpless people. The migrations were the moving phenomena and the tragedy. For while we have seen that many of them ended with the rebirth of new states from one end of the continent to the other, states that stood until Arabs and Europeans delivered the final death blows, millions of other blacks were unable to achieve this temporary glory. These were the Africans whose daily task was sheer survival, nothing less, nothing more. Every one of their communities had 4 to 6 months of each year which everyone knew as starving times, the period when children ate dirt and the bark from trees, where it was a great occasion if food enough could be found for 2 or 3 meals a week, when to find a water hole or a little stream that had not completely dried up was even more joyful than finding something to eat, and a time when some mothers would steal away into the bush with their little skeleton-like children with swollen bellies to die quietly in the shade. This was starving times. During this awful period of hell on earth, even the better-off cattle-raising groups outside of the Set's fly regions suffered great losses in herds as they wandered far and wide in the frantic search for unparched grassland and water. In none of this are we dealing with the merely unusual misfortunes which are occasionally visited upon almost every people. No, we are dealing here with the unusual, something quite different in the general experience of mankind, for we are reviewing here a permanent solution which, in combination with the forces outlined in foregoing pages, destroyed the civilization of an entire race, checked progress, and forced countless thousands into barbarism. These were the people who sought freedom and security in the forests, swamps, and caves. Some, unable to advance under these conditions, nevertheless battled against sinking to the level of savages. Some rebuilt their states even in the vast forests, and still others, famine-crazed, became savages or semi-barbarisms. Many of the groups that descended to this lowest state of existence were isolated in areas where starving times was not a period of months, but of years. The worst outcome from the forced migrations all over Africa in the long search for places of refuge and freedom were the endless splintering off of societies into countless little isolated states. Overall, it is difficult to see how it could have been otherwise. They had to split up. Unity in terms of keeping a very large group together was impossible. Seldom could 10,000 people move en masse, and not to mention 100,000. And 100,000 would be a small number if it was a great state that was being disorganized and destroyed. If they were being attacked by invaders, not only expediency, but life itself dictated that they split up into small groups, each under an elected leader. In this way, both the chances of escape from the enemy and of finding food and water somewhere were better than would be the case if they moved in one vast body. Some of these separated groups did indeed meet again by chance before they had become total strangers to each other. These often settled in the same general region, and near enough to each other to maintain the same language. Others met again generations after the original segmentations, met as strangers speaking in different tongues, and with different patterns of culture, strangers, yet all descendants from the same society. Worse still, the blacks have been so busy being different through all these years that they have been unable to see that underlying all of their cultural varieties is the compelling evidence that they are all members of the same race and have the same common origin. And this is the best and most remarkable outcome of the migrations with their fragmentations, disunities, and interminable turmoil and crises, that they held on, tenaciously held on, to the fundamentals of the same constitutional principles, the same democratic and political systems, and the same social institutions, maintained from one end of Africa to the other, just as though they were still members of one and the same vast African society. This fact was immediately reflected in the institutions and political structure of every new state that emerged during all those centuries of migrations. Just as the council told Ethiopian kings what they could and could not do, the same remained true throughout the continent where black rule prevailed according to tradition. This is why 3,000 years later, and 3,000 miles farther south, a Shaka could complain bitterly because the Zulu council of yes-men failed to check him in his excesses. Finding himself an absolute autocrat, he was surprised to find that he had been allowed to get away with it. A view from the bridge. What, then, is the view from the bridge? The outlook is grim. For the black people of the world, there is no bright tomorrow. The blacks may continue to live in their dream world of singing, dancing, marching, praying, and hoping, because of the deluding signs of what looks like victories, still trusting in the ultimate justice of the white man. But 1,000 years hence, their descendants will be substantially where the race was 1,000 years before. For the white people, still masters of the world, do not have to yield. They have never changed the real attitude toward black people during all of the passing centuries, and there is absolutely nothing upon which to base the belief that they will change in centuries to come. Concessions on some demands, yes. Expediency dictates this. Noting that the black masses accept as leaders any and all Negroes who hold important positions, the whites, who control these positions directly or indirectly, actually determine who the leaders of the blacks shall be as independent black organizations emerge. The dangling attractions of government and foundation grants are there to quiet the outspoken but money-hungry leaders. Indeed, some of these leaders were quick in discovering that the most certain route to a handsome grant or loan is pretended outrage and shouting militancy. The whites know this all too well. They are quite willing to pour millions of dollars into all kinds of black community projects precisely because they know that these phony leaders will do nothing that will really improve the conditions under which the black masses live. Blacks are still hopelessly naive if they do not yet understand that the whites never did, and do not now intend to include the blacks in the doctrine of human equality, equal justice, or anything else that means real equality. The white determination to keep blacks in an inferior position is so deep that they will battle against the enactment of civil rights laws even when they know there will be no real enforcement. The opposition is to the very idea of equality. Those Negroes who are so frantically fighting to escape from the African race by way of integration and amalgamation will continue to meet everlasting and universal opposition from the whites. The Negro drive to be with whites in every situation is equaled by the white determination to prevent it. Yet the whites must truly feel a deep sense of pride in seeing this Negro leadership so clearly validating their own belief in white superiority. Their pretended quality education objective actually collapses under the wheels of buses for racial balance. They are proclaiming to all the world that, regardless of general desegregation, in any all-black or predominantly black population, the blacks themselves are utterly incapable of achieving or maintaining high standards of excellence in education, or, indeed, anything else. Here we have, within the race, the intolerable situation of an anti-black group proclaiming the race's inherent inferiority more effectively than the whites ever could, precisely because this group is regarded as black. Furthermore, and even of greater importance, the amalgamationist Negroes generally hold most of the administrative and key teaching posts in the educational system. Through their sheer indifference, therefore, they can block the development of the quality education in black schools while, at the same time, sending their own children to white private schools. Their remaining interest in the black schools is the money derived from their supervisory and teaching positions. Meanwhile, black students in the so-called integrated schools and colleges throughout the United States continue to tell the world that they are as segregated within as they were without. Far from being accepted, daily insults of various kinds occur inside the classrooms, in the halls, and on the outside. When a fight breaks out, as they inevitably do, and the police are called in, they generally arrest the black students, not the white students, no matter who started the trouble. A press report, September 15, 1972, simply read, "During the recess hour, a black male student was called an offensive name by two white boys and pushed against the wall. A general fight broke out between black and white students. Police were called. 13 black students were arrested and jailed." Now, of course, all this is public information and is news to no one. But some of the salient facts that seem to stand out clearly are as follows. 1. White America is definitely and unalterably opposed to the integration and amalgamation of the two races. 2. Black America, the masses, are equally opposed to the integration and amalgamation of the races. 3. The drive for more and more amalgamation is, and always has been spearheaded by those coloreds who maintain a separatist society within the black race and who are not, and never have been, identified with the black masses. 4. Since everybody knows that there are millions of light-skinned members of the race, some as white as any Caucasian, who are as African in spirit and as are devoted to the race as anyone else, the crucial question is how long will this other white-oriented group be allowed to block the real progress of the race? 5. Those who seek and hope for admittance into white society should not be criticized or condemned. As previously stated, it is an individual matter of choice, and it is both natural and right if their blood call is to the white race rather than to the black. But they cannot be allowed to use their imposed leadership positions to browbeat all black Americans into the line of march into white society per se, and thus towards the ultimate extinction of blacks as such in this country. It is along this line, against their benign genocide, that the real battle for survival as a distinct people must be fought. 6. The drive for integration is most damnable on one score alone. It is a deliberate and stepped-up attack on the most significant aspects of the Black Revolution of the 60s. That revolt was the reversal in the psychology of the race, a quest for its lost manhood by first emancipating the mind from the bondage of over-Caucasianization, and to establish forever the real basis for equality with the rest of mankind from the undiscovered pages of a history that was supposed to be lost because it reveals a long line of giants unsurpassed by any people on earth. The Negro integrationists are hostile to the Black Revolution and aim to defeat its main aims by forcing the black children and youth of a nation more directly under white education. Once again, as in slavery, they will be cut off not only from the history of their race, but they will also be cut off from a knowledge of all other fields of which the blacks have excelled and from which comes the inspiration to go forth and do likewise. The great mental revolution among the blacks that eventuates in more and more self-respect, a new sense of manhood and self-worth. All this alarms the Negro integrationists, and they are resolved to defeat it by keeping the blacks firmly under the mind control of white institutions. 7. They are absolutely right about the general lack of quality education in black schools, the very schools in which they are the principal supervisors and teachers. But their minds and interests are elsewhere. Ghetto children are unteachable, they assure themselves. And they and their equally misguided principals and teachers of all kinds will fight to the death a Clark or any other plan that is expressly designed to improve the teaching and learning process in black schools. They fear the very idea of community control because it presents the possibility that irate parents might demand the removal of the merely job-holding and indifferent principals and teachers. 8. The millions of Africans of mixed blood who have always been steadfast and devoted to the race know that when the white man gives them a preferential status above the unmixed, but always below himself, he does so to maintain the myth of superior white blood. Their redemption from the sin of African blood is proportionate to the amount of white blood in their veins. Indeed, if one is light enough, or near white, he may even be appointed secretary of a department of the U.S. government and a member of the president's cabinet, and still not equal. Furthermore, white America has found that their purposes were served best by classifying as Negro all persons with any amount of African blood, no matter how small. This obvious injustice has never been openly challenged even by those directly affected and bitterly resent being so classified. But the United States refused to follow either the South African system of making their Afro-Dutch offsprings a separate ethnic group by law and calling them coloreds, or the ancient practice of Egypt and the Arab world of classifying mixed breeds as white. This fact has had a tremendous impact on integrationist Negroes in the United States, leading many to identify with the Arab world rather than Africa, and even to adopt Arabic names rather than African names. In fact, because of their powerful hold on Africa throughout the religion of Islam and the vast colored population in many Arab states, many white Arabs will publicly state, for African ears, that they are a non-white people. However, even if the United States did attempt to reclassify this group as either white or colored, the millions who are bound to the African race by unbreakable ties of love would fight such a move to its death. These have no desire to be either white or colored. For like the late Congressman Adam Clayton Powell, who could have passed for white anywhere in the world, they would say, "Call me black," knowing full well that black refers not to anyone's color, for which none is responsible, but black defines one's attitude toward the homeland of his ancestors, which from times immemorial was called the land of the blacks. So something different developed in black America, for whereas in most other parts of the world the mulattoes form an elite caste, this is true only of certain groups in the United States, such as the Weezots of Maryland and Virginia, also known by other names, and their spillover in Washington, D.C. In general, the divided loyalties split them as anti-African and pro-African, which is the way it has always been. The view from the bridge thus far has been a refocus on the futility of our continuing and childlike faith in the white man's justice, the belief that our protests, marching demonstrations, singing and praying will change his 6,000 years of hostility to us, and that the Negroes who frantically battle for admission into white suburbia and to its private clubs, golf courses, swimming pools, etc. will never be welcomed even though they may be near white in color. The final focal point in this connection is that the masses, from the blackest of the blacks to the lightest of the lights, do not care at all about socially mixing with the whites. They, the whites, on their part, have no reason or inclination to do more than make token concessions from time to time, thus quieting noisy leaders, but never changing the inferior situation of the masses. They still own and control the wealth of Africa, directly and indirectly, and from it, along with that from other areas of the world, they have developed technologies and a world commerce, all fully protected by governments, also under their control, that assure them of continued white supremacy. This phenomenal success, this unquestionable position of strength, derived from their conquests of other people and their wealth, has led them to believe that they are, as a matter of fact, the superior people, and therefore the rightful rulers of this planet. Why, then, should they be expected to yield? Human rights? Equal justice? What are these but narcotic slogans for the masses? Even the white masses, which are quickly conceded as ideals and principles everywhere. The masses of poor whites who also live on these slogans and ideals of equal justice. They are a pitiful people, often half-starved themselves, yet living and having their being in the happy thought that they are members of the white conquering race, and that the once enslaved blacks among them are living evidence of their own superiority. They enjoy the glory reflected from the domination and power achieved by the ruling minority of the race, too ignorant to realize that they are used as the tools of hate to support the wealth and power concentrated in relatively few hands. When these poor whites secure the kind of jobs that move them up in that glory land called middle class, they get the most concrete evidence of their innate superiority. They find that the economic system is so structured that, 1. To secure better jobs and advancement, the number one qualification is to be white. 2. That even where only a token number of non-whites are employed, they may be required to have college degrees, and sometimes the masters, while the higher salaried whites, including the supervisors, may not have a high school education. These are not merely may and may not theories. In the United States, the official statistics show that nationwide, black college graduates not only earn $1,040 a year less than white high school graduates, but they also earn less than a white 10th grader. The white college graduate averages $3,095 more than the black college graduate. 3. Blacks must pay more to live than whites. The lower wages they receive and the higher prices they must pay are built-in guarantees that they will always occupy an inferior place in the society. Merchants now generally have two prices for the same goods, one black and one white. With the uneducated blacks, they are having a field day. They are equally successful in robbing the educated black middle class because of its abiding faith and status-striving complex. These are the Negroes who readily pay $225 a month for a house just vacated by whites who rented it for only $125, and Negroes who buy $25,000 homes listed to whites for from $5,000 to $10,000 less, provided, of course, that white folks previously lived there. And the inner-city food markets charge higher prices for cheaper brands of canned goods and equally high prices for leftovers from their first-class stores in surrounding white suburbia. And 4. The insurance companies face this economic war on the blacks boldly and actuarially. They simply charge blacks more for less benefits. Blacks must pay much higher premiums than whites for life insurance, for example, because it has been determined that their life expectancy is 10 years less than that of whites. For the insurance industry, it is strictly a matter of business. They know that the total economic system is so structured against the blacks that it is impossible for them to maintain proper health standards. Being black, they must die first, by 10 years. All this gives comfort and assurance to the poor and once poor, silent majority. They feel that they have every reason to be silent, for does not this silent and secret war against the blacks, carried on every hour of their existence and deeply structured in the very fabric of national life, public and private, does this not reassure them every day that they are, indeed, members of the supreme ruling race? The view from the bridge had to focus first on the United States, because so much points to this land as the place where the first major racial explosion is likely to occur. One would think that South Africa and Rhodesia feel more secure with huge American investments and military backing than America itself is. A view of the motherland. This brings us to the main reason for the focus on America. It quickly assumed the role of the whole white West as the various powers were forced from their imperial rule in Asia and Africa. Forced, that is to say, from direct political rule, or the political functions of colonialism. The world at large, in the greatest misconception of modern times, took this to mean African independence at last, African freedom, and the end of European colonialism. The plain truth is that the African states today are not even half free and independent, for colonialism was from the beginning exactly what it is today, an economic system for control and exploitation of the wealth of other peoples. It was and is a private enterprise system. Colonial government was initially company government. When the political task got too big because of the increasing rivalries between the great powers, the mother countries would appoint colonial governors and other administrators. In other words, government by the home country came in as a protecting umbrella for the main objective, economic exploitation. That economic control still prevails all over Africa. It's not neo-colonialism, but the old colonialism itself, still carrying on under the beautiful and high-flying flags of independent African nations. The various mineral resources that are so vast and involve so many billions of dollars that individual Africans, called upon to decide whom they will serve, their people or the masters of their country's wealth, often decide to serve the latter. The fact that Africa is still in economic bondage to her former political masters brings us back to our point of departure. As the more political colonialism disappeared, the United States rushed in to fill the breach, to take up the banner as the leader of the free world, the Atlantic or Western powers, and hold the line of white supremacy throughout the world. The American military bases scattered all over the world have meaning far beyond any supposed communist threat. Rich European nations no longer need to maintain their usual armies for defense, for their great white brother, Uncle Sam, will gladly draft men to keep American forces there. American armed might is everywhere, ready to rush in and play the self-assigned role. This New World mission of the United States replaces, as far as it can, the more direct rule of the Western powers over the non-white peoples. The threat to black Africa and black people everywhere should be obvious. From the very beginning, for example, the American secret policy was to give little or no assistance to Africa. Outright grants, such as the billions poured into Europe, were never expected by the black nations. The Africans had enough sense to know that such free gifts were for whites only, but they did not expect to secure loans on reasonable terms of repayment. The American attitude on loans to African states turned out to be about the same as it would have been if they had been begging for free grants. There was a very definite African policy, however. The policy was not to announce the policy. There was a public announcement of what was intended as a policy early in the 1960s. It said to Africa, in effect, that the United States would continue its friendly interest and, as always, said little or nothing in the matter of loans. Other friendly advice included the well-known information that they could apply to the World Bank. The big American air and military base in Ethiopia made it a favored African state like Libya. American investments in 2 other African states enabled them to secure loans. Black nations that might overcome the foreign economic stranglehold within their countries by increased production and exports for foreign exchange find their export trade blocked by the tariff walls of the same United States and the same European powers whose industrial machines would be crippled without the wealth, mineral resources, and basic strategic materials they still control and ship out of Africa. In a word, the blacks neither own nor control the wealth of their own land. Supposedly free again, they are unable to rebuild even as well as their migrating forefathers did before the Arab and European conquests. As shown in previous chapters, freed of the white man's control, a control from which most of them were fleeing, they were overriding all obstacles and successfully building and rebuilding new states until they were finally overtaken in the 19th and as late as the beginning of the 20th century. The overall view from the bridge, then, is simply the view of where and how the black people of the world stand today, after a summary review of at least 6,000 years of their history. And whether the focus is on Africa, the Caribbeans, the Americas, or elsewhere, they are now seen standing at the crossroads of history and confused.
Please consider supporting us by clicking on the like and subscribe buttons. Your support will be greatly appreciated.